Morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We have this morning Lucie Sénéchal-Perrault, who is from the French National Center for Scientific Research, and she will be doing a presentation today about the Chinese commercial launch sector. Given that we started about 10 minutes late, this session will go on until 9:40 instead of 9:30, depending on the availability of the speaker. So we're going to go ahead and get started, and I give the floor now to Lucie.
Hi, thank you for the introduction. Hi, my name is Lucie Sénéchal-Perrault. Thank you so much for having me here, and thank you for attending this presentation, which I hope will interest you. So I'm a PhD candidate at the French National Center for Scientific Research, CNRS, and the School of High Study in Social Sciences. Today, my presentation is going to be on the Chinese commercial launch sector, which I've been studying for the past 3 years, debating the idea that there is a diversity of players in an emerging market. So I really like this illustration as a way to present what I am not going to do, which is giving you a vision of Chinese commercial space or Chinese space activities in general that is widely broadcasted in a short format and the mainstream press in general. Why is that? So when we study Chinese space activities at large and Chinese commercial space activities in particular, we have a tendency to apply tropes or pre-existing narratives to it. As was rightly put by the Secure World Foundation in their report, Lost Without Translation, the space industry is inextricably linked to national security issues, which means that China's space industry is framed through a lens of great power competition and national ambitions to increase space capabilities, etc. And they are considered in relation to the impact on US national security. So what I am going to do, what I try to do in my research is heavily base myself on Chinese sources. The sources I use are CNKI. You might be familiar with it or you might not. It would be the equivalent of a JSTOR, so that's a database for academic articles. In the case of commercial space, I would more talk about specialized articles at large than really academic, because it is not an academic topic. But a JSTOR, so such a database, that would be a monopoly, in a situation of monopoly, meaning that we can reasonably infer that most of the articles available in China, scientific articles, are on this platform, which is very convenient when making research. Then another source that I use is called ITCHA, which is so a database reuniting information on enterprises in China. You might be familiar, if you work with China, with this kind of database. The information on it is quite reliable because it stems directly from the industry offices in China. And so a lot of this information is made public, even though recently access to such databases is a little more difficult than it used to be. Then I also have a number of field interviews for which I am very lucky, as I had the opportunity to go to China in May 2033, so this year, to attend the activities of the Chinese Space Day, which is big, like yearly reunion in the space sector, and then later on in Beijing, where I could interview most of representative of Chinese commercial space launch enterprises. And then I follow WeChat official account. For those not familiar with WeChat, it would be the equivalent of Twitter and Facebook for the kind of data that I'm using. So enterprises have official accounts on WeChat, and they regularly publish information for the most of them. And so I try to base myself on Chinese sources and to have a factual approach. If you should remember one thing from this presentation, is that China, so that would be in the article of Axios, which I just shown you, this big threatening Cold War star, is not one. China is not a monolith. And in Chinese commercial space activities, there is a diversity of players, which do not necessarily all have the same interest. So, schematically speaking, you can say there is the state on the one hand, but within the state, you have the central government, which will have these sort of big directions, generally pushing forward commercial space in a somewhat lofty, very broad approach. Then you have provincial governments, which are in charge of implementing those general policies and are in competition with one another in terms of ranking, in terms of evaluation of cadre for their career evolution. And then you have a number of technical bodies which are going to take much more concrete and limited in scopes regulatory texts. Then if you look at the industry, you have SOEs, which are mainly CASC and CASIC, which have their own interests and are actually not very happy with commercial space because it is a de facto new competition. And then you have new private enterprises who want to obviously thrive and have their own business. So there is one thing you should remember from my presentation is that there is no one big monolithic China when evaluating Chinese space activities. All right. So my presentation is going to be divided in two parts. First, we're going to talk about the very notion of commercial space, 商业航线. Then we will talk about Chinese commercial launch enterprises, which I've been working on in the past years. All right. So first, the notion of commercial space. Commercial space is the Chinese version of a trend that has globalized, which is new space. So new space is a phenomenon that starts in the US, in the Silicon Valley, whereby new players, namely investors and entrepreneurs, enter a field that was originally the preserve of the state, space. This was considered a positive experience by a number of countries, and by the mid-2010, a number of states take their own national strategies so as to implement commercial space, new space, within their own system. So in Europe, that was a case of France and Germany. My humble point of view, not a great choice of name, open space in France. And then in broader Asia, you have Japan, India, and of course, China taking their own text, like implementing their own strategies. In China, it is consensual to say that it is the guiding opinion on encouraging social investment and finance mechanism in priority innovation field that started this trend. Although you can find other texts that sort of mention it. And this text is sometimes dubbed document number 60. I would like, if you use this document, I would rather advise you use the term guiding opinion, because in a context, as I've shown, where Chinese space activities are perceived in a securitized manner, saying that it's a document somehow implies that it's something secret, where it really is not. It's a very public document that is clearly identified as a guiding opinion. So this commercial space, this phenomenon starting in the mid-2010, actually arrives in China in a broader historical context. And before commercial space, there was already a tendency called space commercialization. So here you have the results of for the search words commercial space on CNKI, the databases for specialized article that I was mentioning earlier. And as you can see, there is a massive increase in the number of publication around 2014, reaching a peak in 2019, and then somehow a deflation. But before that, you have a number of articles that are published every year from the 1990s on. And this is because before commercial space, there was a previous tendency called space commercialization. And it is very important to make a distinction between those two trends. All right, space commercialization is a phenomenon that appeared as soon as the 1980s, whereby SOEs, state-owned enterprises, that's Kask and Kasich, which I was mentioning earlier, went on the commercial market, that is both the civilian market within China and the international market for launches. That is because in the 1980s in China, there is a huge change in policies, which you might have heard of, which is the reform and opening policy led by Deng Xiaoping. Before that, since there were strategic weapon programs, space endeavors benefited from virtually unlimited support from the state. And now with Deng Xiaoping in power, whose priority is the development of China, the economic development of China, this support is going to go to other industries, for example, light industries. And so it is asked from those enterprises to have their own budget. And one way to get this budget is to sell to the civilian market things such as motorbikes, even fridges, transistor radios, and on the international market, sell launch service from Long March rockets. That is why the China Great Wall Industry Corporation is created as soon as the 1980s with the end to commercialize Long March rockets. But it is still the operating unit is still SOEs. Now, commercial space is a new phenomenon whereby investors and entrepreneurs, among which private, create enterprises. And those trends cohabit and overlap today, meaning that even enterprises that were created after 2014 can belong to rather space commercialization trends. So commercial space in China is a very composite thing, which I will illustrate in the case of launchers. All right, now this notion is uncertain for foreign observers because of language barriers. Their terms are very close. Also, I did a choice in giving you this definition. It is not necessarily consensual. I base it on the work of one author, which has published nearly 10% of the overall available literature, but not everybody agrees with this definition. Now, why is there an uncertainty even among Chinese authors as to what is commercial space? One element is, of course, that it is a complex issue and it is also a trendy one. So as you have seen in 2019, there were tons of publication, right? And so you want to publish on this topic because it is a hot topic, but you don't necessarily know about it. So you will just write about commercial space, saying that commercial space is a good thing, is a desirable trend, but you will not necessarily be extremely informed about it. That's one element. Another element, on the other hand, which I find very interesting, is that this uncertainty as to what is commercial space and whether or not it includes spin-off to state-owned enterprise is instrumentalized. It is by design, because since commercial space is a tendency that is encouraged by the central state, state-owned enterprises cannot frontally oppose to it. So strategy that they could be using is to play the market card and say that they actually encourage commercial space and that they are themselves doing commercial space. this vision of things has been like this uncertainty of concept is criticized. And what I find interesting in the literature review which I conducted is that the two authors that criticized this lack of clarity among the concepts also have very different opinion. Like Shen Yan, who's this author I'm quoting right now, he's opposed to commercial space, whereas Liu Yufei, she's pro-commercial space, and they are both saying that there is a problem in the definition. Now, when you look at publication under the search word commercial space, what you find is that the main publications that give us these articles are actually backed by sponsor institutions that belong to SOEs. The one I put in red are CASC. The other one is, the blue ones are CALT, but CALT is also a subsidiary of CASC specialized in launches. So as you could see, those enterprises, these SOEs, they are in a situation where they dominate discourses, at least specialized discourses. And so they will have an influence eventually on how it is coined. And so it is very possible, it is my opinion, that they actually exploit this uncertainty. So here are CASC and CASIC. It's their booth at the China Space Day activities in April 2023. I thought it was interesting to give you this picture because it shows you first symbolically their place in this exhibition. It's the first booth of enterprises you get to, the first one you see when you follow the track, and they're very big and put like inequality, two equally big enterprises. So there are many different estimates of the number of commercial space companies in China. In some cases, differences comes from the very definition of the term commercial. That quotation is from a very good report from the Institute for Defense Analysis, which is evaluation of China's commercial space sector. And now we're going to dig a little bit deeper in the topic, taking the example of the launch sector. So let's study the Chinese commercial space launch enterprises now, and we will start with their capital structure. So according to the IDA, there is a typology of enterprises within commercial space, and they make these typology based on interviews they had with Chinese players in this ecosystem, and divided into 4 types. In our case, there will be only 3 types, because in the launch sector, you don't have the 4th type, which is of established private companies and their subsidiaries engaging in commercial space. One example for it, which we will talk a little bit about later, is Geely, which is a massive auto company who owns Volvo cars, for example, and has some shares in Daimler, who has created its spin-off for satellite constellations. But what we have in the launch sector is enterprises that are commercial subsidiaries to SOE, namely one, which is X-Space, funny name, which is a subsidiary to CASIC. And we have Mixed Ownerships Corporation, backed by the Chinese Academy of Sciences, that is CAS Aerospace. And then we have privately held startups. So I took all the information I could about those enterprises, like qualitative and quantitative information, and studied their investors. This list of enterprises is not comprehensive in a way, it's an informed choice I made of enterprises. According to some accounts, there are as many as 40 enterprises in the launch sector, although I think that this account would include enterprises that are engaging in making components, so I did not want that. Also, I voluntarily excluded CAS Aerospace, China Rocket, sorry, excuse me. I voluntarily excluded China Rocket because it's a change of name for China Long March Rocket. And it was created in 1998. So especially for quantitative data, I thought it was not so rigorous to mix it up. And I also did not take into account China Great Wall Industry Corporation because they're only doing servicing. And also they were created in the 1980s. So it also does not work from a quantitative perspective. So what I found is when I took the group 3 enterprises, which are like startup, like private companies, is I found that a majority of the investment is really to identify as stemming from individuals. Like when you click on the name of the investor, well, it's not the name for a company, it's a name for a person. And so you would see that back in 2019 was a clear majority of the investments coming from this type of investment. Now it is a little bit more diluted, but still close to a majority of shares. That stems from individuals, and those individuals are in the large majority founders of these enterprises. And you also have some funds on which I would click, and then those funds were owned only by individuals themselves, so natural persons that were also in the member of the board or CEOs of those enterprises. And those I would call indirect individual investments. And so when you look at the total of investment, in some cases, it is an overwhelming majority of the funding. In some cases, it is close to a majority of fundings that comes from the founders themselves. And so with that, we can say that these are not only private enterprises, they are also startups, because that's one of the very definition of a startup, that the funders take the risk to invest in those enterprises. For the rest of the investment, it is much more difficult to evaluate whether they are private or public investment. What is kind of certain is that they are VC, venture capitalism, but it is also known that in China, some sectorial or local funds, policy funds, can be backed by the public. What was told to me in the interviews, both in enterprises and also by a counselor, that is Future Aerospace. So it would be the Euroconsult of China, Weilai Hangtian, Future Aerospace. They also told me that it was a minority share, that it exists, those funds exist, that are sort of state capitalism funds. But one, they're not at the central level. The central government doesn't give financial backing to these enterprises. An opinion that's also consensual in well-informed English language sources. And that the sources stemming from this kind of state capitalism is a minority. Like it would be between 5-10% maximum tops. So currently what I can tell you is that it for me is difficult to identify the nature of the other funds investing in those enterprises, and we should be aware that there is this type of investment. If you do use this data, please quote me, like it's the first time it goes public, so I'm really excited to show it to you. And now another element that I think is really important when understanding and studying Chinese commercial space activities, notably in launchers, is the provincial element to it. That is that, as I said, provinces are in competition, and when you look at the involvement of enterprises on the field, especially when you look at their subsidiaries, their labs, etc., you can see that they are in various governments, various provincial they are present in various provinces, and so that element is not really taken into account in the English literature, nor in the Chinese literature, which I find interesting, but is really present when you talk to those enterprises, and also in their WeChat accounts publication. Here is an example for Orient Space, which signed a contract for establishing a subsidiary in Wuxi. And so they explain that they are going to participate in developing the local ecosystem, etc. So it's an important chain, like the provincial government is an important chain. So to finish, the question we are going to raise is the technological maturity and market prospects for those enterprises. It is difficult to compare, especially if you mash up the three groups of enterprises and make comparison as to their technological maturity. For example, the Kuaizhou, which is the top in the top left of this table, has started launching as soon as 2013 and has dozens of successful launches, whereas the second most advanced one, which is a private one, CRS, failed yesterday on their 10th launch. So you can see that the discrepancy is enormous. What can be seen is a lot of them are concurrent because they're doing very light launches, and one of them is interesting is Landspace because it's really a new kind of innovation since they were doing methane, and they had a successful a world premiere in July. Now their perspective for the development of those enterprises is quite unclear because yes, China is launching more and more satellites, but those are developed by the state. It's a state demand. They belong to the institutional program, not the commercial activities, and they are launched by state-owned launchers, which are extremely safe. That's what they do. Whereas the commercial sector, and I was talking about that with a friend in the sector this morning, is not developing that much. It's not, so their prospect is not very clear. One element that is on everybody's lips is the question of the Chinese mega constellation Guo Xingwang, sometimes also called Xingwang or China Satnet, which is the low Earth orbit internet mega constellation. When you look at English sources on the matter, the problem is that we find again this trope, which is to always look at Chinese activity from a comparison with the US perspective. Here, the image you have from Space News is actually an image from OneWeb, which is like very strange. And now when you look at the Chinese sources, what we have is an announcement in 2021, in spring 2021, for the creation of a new enterprise of this group, China Satnet, which is as you can see, a very short announcement. When you look at CNKI, you have 4 results, among which 2 are off topic because they are too old. And when you look at Baidu, you get very little results. That 32 results is very small. So when you look at Chinese sources, it's also kind of hard to get information. But I will give you some because they're I'm back from the field where this was really debated as a hot issue. So one element is that when you look at Chinese sources, it is talked about as a project that is in Xiong'an, which is the landmark project for a city development under Xi Jinping. Deng Xiaoping wanted to develop Shenzhen, Jiang Zemin wanted to develop Shanghai, and now we have Xi Jinping developing Xiong'an. So it is again a provincial local development project as well. We also have the list, the board members of those enterprises, not all of which stem from CASC and CASIC, who were actually deprived of their own projects because they had Hongyan and Hongyun, which were their own mega constellation project. And now what we see is that the state designated SASAC, which is the State Asset Committee, which is above them in terms of hierarchy. And that is directly in charge with only one constellation, so not using the competition emulation between those two state-owned enterprises. And they also come from a variety of fields. But the question that is on everybody's lips, and for which we don't have an answer yet, is as whether Chinese commercial space, private or CAS, will have a role to play in launching those satellites, since the commercial market is not really there. The communication recently from those launch enterprises has always been, we want to participate in the national constellation. Sometimes they even say we will participate in it, but we do not know whether that is going to happen or not. And there are a number of players who are actually against it, namely state-owned enterprises. They're not so happy with the development of those private rockets, knowing that the state has already invested a lot of public money in developing state-owned rockets, like rockets developed, manufactured by state-owned enterprises. It is not so clear that they are going to let those less reliable, very new, most of them are still in the development stage, rockets. What I found interesting was this article that was published by KES Aerospace, is that they present, they speak about their intention to help in developing national constellations, but there is no word about Geely. Like, they are talking about being installed in Nansha, which is in the Guangzhou, Guangdong area. And they mention this idea that they will participate in Guoxinhuang, but they do not talk about Geely, who was or is developing its own mega constellation. And the idea at the beginning, it was said that it was for them to work together in this area. So yes, very interesting question as to know whether or not private enterprises are going to take part in Guoxinhuang. Thank you for your attention. I don't know if we have time for any questions.
We have time for a couple of questions.
Awesome.
The first question, well, the first thing, it's very interesting that you're using direct Chinese sources in order to create this presentation. Can you comment on any challenges that you encounter precisely looking for using and interpreting Chinese sources?
Yeah, that's a very good question. The first thing I'm gonna say is rather positive, is like, if you speak Mandarin, or like, even when I started my PhD, my Mandarin was not that good. So if you're learning Mandarin at the moment, I really encourage you to continue, because the language barrier is one big barrier. And then you have, even if you don't speak Mandarin, you can also develop some capacity to search on Chinese internet. Now, on the difficulties, well, of course, the COVID was a huge problem, because it was really difficult to conduct interviews without, if you don't have any network, it's really hard to get in touch with people in China for the first time as a foreigner through email, for example. But I could make a network through attending international conferences. And then another problem that there is, another challenge, is the access to databases, which has been shut last April. So it's not really possible to attend use CNKI anymore, or ITCHA. But there are ways, like the China project recently hosted a conference talking about that, and like, researchers have ways to get to the data. Yeah.
And it's interesting also because I imagine that some of the difficulties might be related to the fact of that sometimes parts of the internet in China are not accessible, or there's some level of censorship too.
Yes, this is a very interesting challenge. As I said, players cannot really say openly that they are opposed to something, which is very different from the French culture. When you disagree with something, you're just going to write, "Oh, I do not agree." And I only had one author among all the articles I read, which was openly opposed to commercial space. So they will not say, and there is this whole thing, right, of playing the market card, that they are pretending that they are for a commercial space, but under their definition, the definition of state-owned enterprise, which includes themselves, right? So that's really fascinating and difficult, but I think that's when you're a researcher, when you're studying a PhD, you really have the time to do that, to dig into it. Because if you study this fast, you might get not scammed. Scammed is not really the idea, but you might just take the content you read for granted. But you should not. You have to take a distance and think, okay, who owns this magazine? Why are they saying that? Who wrote this article? Where are they working? Might they be biased? But that's not only when you work about China. That's the general work of a researcher, I think.
That makes a lot of sense. We have one other question from Mike Gray. To what extent is the central government coordinating with private enterprises to invest in things that relate to China's national security, military, and spacefaring capabilities? Can you comment on that?
So I think there are maybe two questions in there, or I can give two answers. So the investment from central governments that I know of does not really exist. The role of the central government is to foster, like to literally authorize those enterprises, be it in the launch sector or in the satellite sector, authorizing them to exist. To be honest, it was not even really a part of the plan to have launch enterprises be created. So it's almost a bottom-up sort of phenomenon. Now, the state is wanting those enterprises to develop also to, well, the idea is to get new innovations, right? To get innovations, technological innovations, or maybe even business innovation, new kinds of ecosystem in the provinces. It's like technologically develop the country. And so one element in there could be to foster, that would be the second part of the answer, that's civil military integration, which is often misunderstood in the Chinese case because there are two parts in civil military integration. One is the civil goes to the military, and the other is the military goes to the civil. And I think in the case of space is much more the second thing, because what is talked about a lot in the article is the idea of opening the infrastructure that was initially monopolized by the military. One very good example is launch pads, which are operated by the PLA. And it's a huge difficulties for commercial enterprises to launch in there, or test facilities that are in military-linked laboratories. They have lots of difficulties to test their products in there. So the idea is much more to, in this civil military should be understood in this sense much more, because at the level of development, the current level of development, those enterprises are not really able to sell new interesting stuff to the military. It's more the other way around, actually. The military is selling subparts to them. But in my opinion, it's not really going the other way around because they're not advanced enough. Now what will be in the future if those enterprises survive, because we're not sure they are going to survive, I cannot tell. Maybe it will bring some interesting new innovations to the Chinese military. Maybe.
Well, thank you so much, Lucy. This was a very interesting presentation. We remind the audience that all the sessions are being recorded and we will post them in the website after the conference. The videos are open access and we'll let everybody know. Thank you again, and we hope to see you in the next sessions. We'll have our next keynote at 10:20 a.m. Thank you.
Thank you.